we're having just a time of sharing stories of grace. You know, these are the hardest stories to come up with in a sermon. Stories that point to God acting in the world today. And we're very privileged today to have a great panel of presenters. Sarah Hahn is the assistant professor of pastoral ministry and the director. Now get the name of this. This is terrific. The Tyndale Center for Pastoral Imagination. What a great institute that is at Tyndale University. And the Reverend Erin Oxford is the executive director and pastor of the Dale Ministries. And that's a church without walls. And it's a church that meets in different places and all kinds of creative ministries going on there. And Das Sidney is the president of the Canadian Council of Churches, past president of the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec, and is currently interim minister at Westview Baptist in London. Great to have you here. And Reverend Dr. Casey Barton serves as assistant professor and director of the pastoral ministry at Lancaster Bible College and Capital Seminary and Graduate School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He did his work in Toronto at the University of Toronto with me, and I'm so pleased that he's here today. I'm so pleased that all of you are here. And when we think of stories of grace, for me, I shared in my workshop one of the stories that I'll share again here, and that is the story of my grandmother teaching me at an early age what grace meant. And I asked her how Grandpa Thomas died, and she said, well, he was working on his sermon in Granby, Quebec. We were living in Granby, she said, and his office was up on the second floor. And I was down in the kitchen and preparing lunch, and I called him, Thomas, lunch is ready. And he didn't answer. And I called him a second time, he still didn't answer. Third time, she said, I dried my hands on the tea towel and went upstairs, down the hall. His study door was closed, as was common when he was working on his sermon. And she said, as I put my hand on the doorknob, I very distinctly heard a voice. And the voice said, my grace is sufficient unto thee. And I opened the door, she said, and found him slumped dead on the roll-top desk where he had been working on his sermon. It must have been a killer of a sermon. Anyway, she said, because she heard the voice that one time, she was sustained throughout all of her life. She even had more courage than probably she should have, because she took up driving when she was 70. I asked her why she took up driving. She said, because I used to ride my bike into town and I kept on running into the back of cars, and I thought I would be safer. That isn't a story of grace. Another story that I had wanted to share, it's a very small story. Joyce Kelly told it to me. She said she went into a hospital and she was visiting. And she was called as chaplain up to a room. People she didn't know, they were largely unchurched, and the patient was dying plainly, and she came in. The family members were standing around, and she didn't know really what to say or do, but she started, she touched him and she spoke about the significance of this time, and then stood there in silence. And one of the family members who was unchurched said, isn't there something about a Savior, a shepherd? Where had that come from? Isn't there something about a shepherd? Isn't that a wonderful thought? Isn't there something about a shepherd? And one of the dear women in our church, Mary Prime, had her husband died at 62, I think it was, and And very suddenly, in front of her, they had gone to bed, and he had this sudden gasp, and she looked, and he was dead. And she was startled by the peace that came over her. It was a palpable peace. And instead of being moved into tears, and which she certainly was later, but in that moment, she heard herself saying, "Oh, you've come to take my Steve," which is a wonderful affirmation of faith, but for her, it was the presence of Jesus Christ present with her in that moment. And it was a blessed assurance to her that Steve was all right. He was with God. You've come to take my Steve. Where did those words come from, if those words weren't impressed in her mind by the Holy Spirit in that moment? These are stories of grace that we all long for, live for, find in our lives. Sometimes they happen and we don't notice it. But if you take anything good, genuinely good that happens to you, and you tell the story, and you say at the end of it, you ascribe the authorship to God, it becomes a story of grace. It becomes not just a story of somebody doing something good. It becomes a story of God working through somebody in the same way that God works through you and through me. And any time that we can reinforce that sense of God active in our lives, well, we've given people something to lean on. We've given them a God to lean on. All right, we're going to just take the stories in order, and I'm going to be inviting you afterwards, if you want to tell a story, to come forward and share it using the microphone here. And the stories shouldn't be too long, but we'd welcome, if you're thinking of that, to contemplate it while you listen. Sarah. Sure. Yeah, I'll just put it in the center here.
So the first story I want to share, recently my husband and I were in Korea, and we were having a conversation with my mother-in-law, who's kind of like a modern-day prophetess, I like to call her. And she shared something similar to what Paul just shared, where she said, moments of grace happen all throughout the day, and God invites us to join him in those moments. But the invitation comes as like a passing thought sometimes, like a quiet whisper. And she said, you have to catch those whispers and act on it, and then God allows you to be part of his moments of grace. And so my husband and I heard this from my mother-in-law, and then we went on a trip to a coastal mountainside village in Korea, and we were driving through winding mountain roads. I don't know if you've ever been on these country roads in Korea. You go all around the mountainside, and the roads go through the mountains, around the mountains, and on our drive around the mountains, on the side of the highway, which there was barely any shoulder, we saw this old grandmother with a big basket on her back. And in Korea, there are these grandmothers who go into the forest to pick different things to eat and to forage, and yet it was just about time when it was getting dark, so the sun was setting, and we see this grandma on the side of the highway, the mountain highway, with this basket on her back. We drove past her, we looked at each other, and we said, this is one of those moments of grace. We both felt that pull to stop. Now, we had to drive about 15 minutes before we hit the next exit. We had to get off and drive 15 minutes back. So the whole time we're doubting ourselves, like, should we really go? Is she going to think we're crazy? Is she going to be scared? We finally looked back around 30 minutes later, and she was still there, now almost in the pitch darkness with this basket on her back. My husband got out of the car, looked at her, and said, Grandma, do you need a ride? And she looked up from her basket, and she said, it's an angel of God. My husband put her basket in the trunk, she got in the car, and she started singing, 나 같은 죄, Amazing Grace in Korean. And then she began to share, and she said, I got lost foraging in the mountain, and I cried out to the Lord, Lord, save me, help me to get home. I know I'm old, but it is not my time yet. I want to go home tonight. And then she looked at us and she said, praise be to our God, who hears the cry of the no-name hunchback grandmother in the middle of nowhere on a mountainside in Korea and hears her prayer in the middle of the night. We drove 45 minutes to her home. That's how far she was. That's how far she wandered away from home. And we dropped her off. She said, "Thank you for being the angel of the Lord today." It's my first story. I think I have time for one more. Another story I wanted to share is about a gentleman named Will. I'm sharing this with his permission. Will grew up in a home that wasn't Christian, and yet his mom went to kind of one of those radical Christian revivals that happen in Korea and came to know the Lord, and she was on fire. So she came home that day and she said, "I'm giving 80% of my tithe to the Lord." And then Will's dad, who was not a believer, was not happy about this, and so they began having a lot of marital issues to the point where his mom began experiencing a lot of physical abuse. And so it got to the point where she thought she might not make it. So she took Will, ended up leaving her husband, and because she left her husband, that church that she was so devoted to actually excommunicated her. In little Will's heart, that was such a hurt that he vowed to himself, "I will never step foot in the house of this God named Jesus." And he grew up that way. In university, one day, one of his friends, he ended up coming to Canada as an international student. One of his Korean friends said, "Hey, you want to come to church with me? You don't have to come to the service, but afterwards they serve Korean food, so you should come and have lunch." And so international student Will was like, "I don't like this Jesus, but I'm really wanting to eat some kimchi, which is like Korean side dish, so I'm going to go to church with you." Will went to church. He sat down for lunch. He sat next to this older man who kept probing him with questions. "Why are you at church? Have you heard about God?" And Will said, as he was eating his soup, trying to mind his own business, this man's question just started making this anger boil up inside of him. The anger that he knew over so many years of his parents separating, his church rejecting his mom, this anger against this God that he had just grown to hate all of his life. And in that moment, before he could stop himself, he just started lashing out at this old man. Colorful language about why he hated church, why he was only here for the food, why he didn't want to hear the name of Jesus at all. And he just went on this 5-minute rant. Pretty soon he said the whole room was silent, just watching him, cursing this old man out. He finally stopped because he was just out of energy. He looked over, and the old man had tears in his eyes running down his face and just pushed the bowl of kimchi over to him and said, "Eat more. Come every week and eat more." Will said something in that small action, it just broke years of hurt. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm crying. Years of pain. And he felt healed in that moment. He came back to church the next Sunday, and then he went into the service because he decided, "I'm going to give this a try." And then standing on that stage was the old man. And he realized that was the senior pastor that he had cussed out the week before. Will came to faith. He became a youth pastor at that church. And I think I'm crying because Will is my husband. Wow, I did not expect to cry. Will now works as a church planting catalyst. He's helped plant just many, many churches over the past decade, almost 50 churches. And he lives sharing his testimony. And the kind of people God brings to him the most are angry people who hate the Lord. And he's seen God use his testimony to bring so many people to experience the amazing grace of God. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your tears, Sarah. I'm going to tell a bit of the story of the Dale to start. In 2011, we were a very different place. We were known as Parkdale Neighborhood Church, and we had decided for quite some time to actively place at the very center of everything that we do people who are often kept in the margins. And one of the challenges in doing that was, from a church perspective, we weren't going to be sustained based on the tithes of our people, as churches often are. And when I say that, I want to be very careful to mention that people were giving very generously out of what they did have. And so it wasn't about a lack from them, it was just about finding a way forward. And we became dangerously close to shutting down. We had less than what we needed, and was invited at the time to reimagine how we could be, how we could thrive. And this was a collective reimagining. And so together we decided to give up the space that had been ours for a number of years. It was a space that we leased. We gave up nearly everything that we owned, gave it away, or put those things that were just garbage into the garbage. And on a sunny day near the end of June, I took down the sign from our building, and it became the day that I like to say we spilled into the street. And it was a literal spilling into the street. And one of the most beautiful things and grace-filled things I think about that experience was that it was an opportunity for our community that knows transients, because they are very familiar with not being housed, not having everything that they need, to teach those of us for whom that's not our experience, how to do this. And there was one person in particular who kept saying to me, please be reminded that the church is not a building, that we are the living stones, and that we will be church wherever we go. And so nearly a decade later, we are still a church without our own walls, who have repeatedly experienced what I think is the loaves and the fishes, where we have had not more than we needed, but sort of exactly what we needed in the moment when we shouldn't have. And so, I mean, I could go on, and I would love to tell you more stories about how that's true. But it has been truly an experience of feeling like a phoenix was rising out of the ashes. And so, to God be the glory for all of that. And another story is about my mother, who was one of my favorite people, and who was hospitalized for the last 13 years of her life. And that came after having a tumor removed from her brain that was not malignant, but was in a very bad place. It was wrapped around the base of her brainstem. And at first they didn't want to remove the tumor because it threatened to do a lot of terrible things. Ultimately, it was threatening to do exactly what removing it would do if we left it. And so it was removed. It meant that she didn't taste food. For those 13 years, she was tube-fed in a wheelchair. She had what she described as one good finger. She was an artist, and that one good finger allowed her to continue to express herself artistically with an iPad. And there was somebody who went to her one day and said, "Can you tell me about how you respond to God in your suffering? What is it like to be a sufferer?" And she said, "I don't consider myself that. That is not my core identity. I am not simply a sufferer. And in fact, I have everything that I need. I have nothing more to need because of the love and the grace and the power of Jesus and a family that loves me," and so on. And so I'm very aware in my own life, both at the Dale and with a situation like my mother's journey, My husband has multiple sclerosis, and that's been a long journey in and of itself. That somehow, and I've been reflecting on this a lot in preparation for this, the truth that in our suffering, the valleys turn to gold, says Psalm 13. And so we can ask how long, and we can experience grace along the way.
Thank you so very much, both Sarah and Erin. When I think of grace, I think of light and darkness, and I enjoy painting. I do a little bit of painting myself, and one of my favorite artists is Caravaggio, a Renaissance painter who specialized in light and darkness. And you look at his painting of St. Matthew's Calling, for example, and there's a lot of darkness there, but then there's suddenly a shaft of light shining on Jesus and on Matthew, and it sends the whole picture into relief. And this is, for me, a story somewhat like that, but in a different sense, and there are many layers to it. "Mummy," said our little girl, "why can't I be white like you?" It was bedtime, and my wife was putting our 4-year-old daughter to bed. My wife is from southern Ontario, white. And that was when our daughter asked that agonizing question, deeper than that simple, curious question, that says, "Why is the sky blue?" And when I got home from a meeting at the church, no doubt, of course, they'd both been crying, and soon we heard the story behind her question. She'd found a new friend in junior kindergarten, and they'd play at recess and eat lunch together, and they seemed to hit it off very well. But in the second week, she came home in a different mood entirely from school. And then we heard the backstory. She said to us, "Mummy says," her friend had said to her, "Mummy says I can't play with you anymore. She said our nanny and her children have your color, and we don't play with them." We were living in Lawrence Park at the time. David, you'd know the area very well. It's a neighborhood with homes with a median house price of $4 million at the moment, and beautiful cars in the driveway. And be assured, we were living in a church-owned parsonage at the time. And I don't want the story to be about racism, but it is said in that ubiquitous context. I was visiting, for example, a family in the neighborhood, and I rang the doorbell, and the gray steel door slowly swung open. And there stood a taciturn little boy, maybe 6 or 7. He looked me up and down, and he said quite matter-of-factly, "Mummy says, the darker you are, the less you can be trusted." And the mother suddenly appeared, and she said, "I don't know where these kids learn this from. It must be from school." I don't generally lift every rock for evidence of racism. There's no end to that kind of a journey, and you accumulate a heavy armor, the weight of the armor, which is difficult to shed. But late that night, after hearing that story from my 4-year-old daughter, I was ambushed by roiling emotions. You feel like you've taken a body blow, which leaves your insides in a vacuum. You don't know what to do, how to respond. What do you say to a devastated 4-year-old child, your own child, vulnerable and innocent? What do you say to her? "You're marked for life, my child, stained by your color, and a wrecking ball is coming your way to diminish your dreams because you are not worthy. Suck it up, kid. Welcome to our world." Now, I'd not shared this story with anyone, and Sunday arrived, where with all the charm and joy you can muster, you have to lead in worship. Just before worship was to begin, our daughter was in the middle aisle, near the chancel. And striding down the aisle was Dorothy. I wonder if she was still alive in your time, David. No, she was gone. She was a tall, white woman with her hair in a tidy, beehive kind of updo, and a full, flowing gown. She was probably in her early 70s, and she swept up our daughter into the air and gave her a hug and said with joy, "My little lamb." You know, her action did not solve the problem of racism, but it was a gentle salve on an open and fresh wound. I was that feeble victim in a wayside gutter, grateful for that unlikely Samaritan who stopped to bind up his wounds, and she did not even know she was doing it. It was a gift of grace, like a little English daisy waving in the gentle breeze in the haze of darkness. I breathed a prayer of thanksgiving for God's people, for Christ's church, for that social convoy of a loving, caring people flying the banner of a different kind of world. I blinked back my tears and stumbled into my study to gather myself for the start of the worship service. I stepped into my robe, and somehow it did not seem quite so heavy. There are more comments I could make about that story, because I know that all of us carry different kind of burdens, and I hope in the midst of them there's that shaft of light which is the grace of God's presence and grace.
In about, it's probably about, I think it was the fall of 2001, I was in my second year of seminary. I've been married just over 3 years, really loved education, wanted to be a pastor, was really excited about that. And then one day I woke up and exactly half of my head was numb. It was really weird. It was a really weird sensation. I kept poking myself in the head, like, what is going on here? And I didn't think much of it, but that lasted for a while, and I went to the doctor, and the doctor didn't know what was going on, and then it went away. And then a couple months later, it came back, and then it went away, and then it came back, and it went away, and then it stopped being numbness at a certain point, and it started to be pain. And then what was a little bit of pain became a lot of pain. Every day I started to have these severe headaches that centered in my eye and in my temple. And I'd have these every day, and they would last for a month, and they'd stop, come back, and go away. And this went on for a few years, and the doctors never really knew what was going on with it. They diagnosed me with a number of different things, gave me a lot of different medication, but none of it really ever helped. The pain continued on after seminary. My wife and I, we moved to Scotland for 1.5 years, and that's where the pain really became in Scotland. And then when I moved to Toronto, it became at its worst. It was every day, multiple times a day, and it really felt like somebody was sticking a screwdriver through my temple and one through my eye and trying to touch them together. And I became, with severe chronic pain, you become depressed. Your mental health suffers. I didn't sleep. This would keep me up all night. And I got to low points when I lived in Scotland where I would go out in the middle of the night on the weekend and try to find a drunk guy to fight with so that somebody could just punch me in the head, and maybe that pain would be just different than the pain that I was feeling. My wife and I, our relationship really suffered because of this. We'd only been married about 3 years when this started, and I was a pretty awesome guy when that started. But over the next few years, I was not a great guy. This went on in cycles, but after a while, it was almost constant headache. We went on and we had kids. I was able to, I think my doctoral studies here in Toronto were one of the only things that saved me through that time, because I had one thing that I could focus on constantly and consistently. My wife kind of made her life over here with her friends, and I made my life over here in the study at Emmanuel College, and we went on to have kids, moved back to California. I pastored a church, and I was just always in pain. It was constant pain. But I got really good at hiding it. I could be having a conversation with you and be in severe pain, and you wouldn't have known it, because I was good at masking that and faking my way through those conversations. Now, through that time, I started by praying about this. God, I don't know what's going on in my head, but I pray that you take it away from me. God, I don't know what's going on here, but can you just make this stop? Praying for healing, asking friends at church to pray for me. But over a number of years, I stopped going to doctors because doctors hadn't helped me. I stopped asking my friends in my small group to pray for me because I no longer believed that it would help. And then I stopped praying about it completely. And I just believed that this is what God wanted for me. That God really didn't care. Like, God cared about me, but God didn't care really all that much about this pain. I stopped praying about it. I believed in prayer. I was a pastor, and I would pray for the people in my church. I would pray when I led service on Sunday morning, and I believed that God cared about other people's pain. I just stopped caring. I stopped believing that God cared about my pain. This went on for 13 years, and until one day I happened to mention this very casually. I think probably in a sermon I might have mentioned this. And after church, I had Connie, the member of my church, she is the one who is like the most invested in praying for every single situation always. And Connie was very charismatic, very Pentecostal, and very in my face, we are going to pray this out of you. And I was like, Connie, that's fine. You can pray about it. And she said, me and Paul, her husband, me and Paul, we want to come to your office every day at 5:00 and pray for you. And I was like, really? Okay. I was very, very uncomfortable with this. Very uncomfortable. Because it wasn't just Connie and Paul that came. It was Connie and Paul and their friends from other churches that came in my office, and they made me get down on my knees, and they anointed me with oil, and they prayed for me every day, those 5 days that week, at 5:00. And it felt weird. And at the end of that week, my head still hurt. But the one thing that had changed is I realized Connie cared about me. It made me wonder if God cared. And so I said, okay, God, I'm going to go back to the doctor. Haven't been to the doctor for a while, but I'm going to go back to the doctor. I go back to the doctor. She says, and she was not a nice doctor at all. I would try to say hello and make small talk with her, and she just had none of it. Mr. Barton, I'm not here to talk with you today. I'm here to talk about your head. Okay. And she said, we're going to order an MRI. And I said, you know what? I've had MRIs before. It's not going to help. It's not going to show anything. She said, Mr. Barton, why don't you go ahead and be the patient and let me be the doctor? Okay. So we did the MRI. When I came back to her office for results, she must not have looked at it before I walked into her office. She pulls it up on the computer screen. She had a very harsh look on her face. And then when she read the computer screen, her face softened and she said, Mr. Barton, how are you today? And I said, oh no, what's wrong? You're being nice to me, so something's wrong. And she said, Mr. Barton, you have a tumor. You have a tumor, it's not quite in your brain, but close enough. You have a pituitary adenoma, and it's about the size of a ping pong ball, and it's been growing there for years. We didn't know it at the time, but that tumor had been producing a significant amount of growth hormone in my body over those 13 years, causing me to have a condition called acromegaly. A part of acromegaly is, no joke, I think this is, because I experienced it, I think it's kind of funny. It's called acromegalic rage. And it explained me going out into the city those nights looking for somebody to fight just because I was angry and hurt. Within 2 weeks, I was at University of California, San Francisco, met with the doctor who's done more of these surgeries than anybody else in the world. And he goes, oh yeah, we got you. Don't worry about it. I'm kind of worried about it because you're gonna take a part of my head out. I went into surgery, and when I went into surgery, the nurse asked me what my pain level was on a scale of 1 to 10. And I said it was a 7. It was usually hovered around there. And she said, okay. And then I closed my eyes, and I woke up in recovery, and the same nurse was there, and she said, what's your pain level? I said, 0. 0. This is the first time in forever that I could say that. And I just cried, and I cried. And over the next weeks and the next months, I'd like to say that everything was better and everything was fantastic and my life got amazing. And it did in some ways because life didn't hurt anymore. But over those next weeks, I had to figure out how to be a husband without pain. My wife and I had to figure out how to take our two worlds and bring them back together. I had to figure out, how do I interact with my kids now that I don't have this cloud in my head? How do I be a pastor? And all those things were really hard. But what was different was I believed that God cared about it. And I think that through all of those years, there was a lot of chaos in my life and chaos in my head. And God took all of that chaos, even though I believed He didn't care about it. God took it all, and He brought it back to order. And that was in 2014, and I haven't had a headache since. So I'm grateful to God for showing me His grace.
Thank you so much, all of you. Such beautiful stories. And, it's surprising we don't ask each other for stories of grace because we've all got stories of grace. But we aren't very familiar with sharing them, and yet that's what we need so often to encourage us along on the journey. We have about 10 or 15 minutes, if not for just one person, but if anyone has a story they would like to share, that would be most welcome, a story of grace.
Hi, my name is Larry Schneider, and I'm a half-time United Church minister in a small village southwest of London, Ontario. I spent most of my life as a high school English teacher and administrator and principal, and I decided I needed to retire as early as I could because I wanted to be a minister. And I had been doing supply ministry, because if you live in a small town and you are the English teacher, you, I guess, are supposed to be able to stand up in front of people and talk. So I had gone from doing 1 or 2 services a year to the point where I was part-time supply ministering 3 times a month for various churches. And in 1996, I had a car accident, black ice in a van versus a big tree. The front end of the van came in, and I'm not going to repeat Casey's symptoms, but as you had, I had, the entire side of my face and head were shattered, and everything, my ribs, everything, my foot was shattered. They were going to amputate my foot and remove my eye, but by the grace of God, they're all here. And, oh, you're permanently partially disabled now. You'll never work again. Well, I'm stubborn. I said, I got that from my mother. I decided I was going to be a teacher still, but in the office. I had already done my courses to become a principal and vice principal. So I did vice principal for a number of years and then principal, and then I retired, went to Emmanuel College in 2011. So it's great seeing a lot of classmates and some of our professors here this week. And I graduated, I was ordained in 2015. I got a full-time position at a church outside London called Dorchester United Church. And I was there full-time for 2 years, and then on the Labor Day weekend, I had been experiencing some head pain and vertigo, very nasty vertigo, as well as abdominal pain. So I'd been having tests for this, and on Labor Day weekend, my congregation said to me, "You can't do this anymore. Or obviously, you can't stand up here like this in the pulpit." Long story short, I had a brain tumor that had wrapped around the base of my spine and my brain, and it was a real mystery. And they never did decide what caused it, but God made it go away. It dissolved on its own. The pain in my side turned out to be stage 1, then 2, then 3, undiagnosed because I didn't have a very good surgeon. Finally, I was diagnosed with stage 4 liver disease. They thought I could probably survive with my liver for a few years. That turned out to be a few months. The liver failed. I died. But before that, I would disappear. Hepatic encephalitis is a horrible illness. It's when your liver doesn't work, the poisons and toxins build up in your brain, and I would be having a conversation with someone, and then I would disappear. The toxins literally put me to sleep, and this limbic system back here would create this horrible person. Anyway, so I was unconscious for months, and unbeknownst to me, I would appear, but then this other guy would appear a lot more. I bloated. They were taking 20 pounds of toxic fluid out of me every 2 weeks. The night of my transplant operation, they took 50 pounds of that and my old liver and gave me a new liver. My brain was wiped clean. I couldn't talk. I had no language. I couldn't walk. I couldn't swallow. I stayed in the hospital for a long time while they got that stuff all fixed up. But I never cursed God. I never got angry with God after the accident and so on. I'm a very optimistic person. I just said, well, thank God I'm still alive. And before I sort of disappeared from the scene, I learned that my oldest daughter was pregnant. And so what kept me through this was my faith in God and my desire to be a good grandfather. So I made a bargain. I said, hey, if you get me through this, I'll be the best grandfather you could ever be. And eventually I'll go back to ministry. And so I went back to ministry. I last preached September 2017. I went back into part-time ministry this April. It took me a long time to convince the United Church of Canada that there was enough synaptic function here to let me do it. And I now have 5 young grandchildren. Thank you.
Grace abounds. Anyone else? Give your name first, okay?
So I'm Reverend Louise Didam, and I'm serving at Prince of Peace Church in Wasaga Beach, and I once took Paul Scott Wilson's preaching course. So I wanted to take you back to December 23rd, 2013. And for those of you who live in Toronto, may recall an ice storm that year. So our house was in darkness, and for complicated reasons, I had no car. I was a part-time divinity student, and I had been visiting someone in palliative care. And I had visited her every week, and I was planning to visit her for Christmas. But there was no power across most of the city. But I just felt that I should go anyway, somehow. So I called a taxi, and the taxi and I concluded that we could probably make it. And every street intersection was the flashing lights. Whole expanses of the city were black. And I'm not quite sure why I decided to do it, because it was a little bit irrational, perhaps. And I had to go all the way across the city. And I finally arrived, and the whole surrounding area around the palliative care facility where she was black. And in the midst of the black, their building was lit up. It was on emergency power. So I walked in, and it was really quiet. There were no visitors. I was the only one, and there were very few staff also. And I walked right in. I knew where to go. And I arrived, and everything was half lit. The emergency power meant that not all the lights were on. And I walked into the room, and there she was. We'll call her Jane. And Jane said, "Oh, you came." Yeah, I did. She said, and she had only one visitor who ever visited her other than me, and it was a sister-in-law. She said, "My sister-in-law just phoned, and she said she can't come. There's some problem with the roads." Because she had no idea what was going on outside her room. I told her what was going on. I just said, "Oh," and she was a bit sad. And I said, "Well, look, I brought the leaflet from the church from last Christmas. Would you like me to read the story of Luke, Christmas story?" "Oh, yes," she said, "that would be nice." So I asked her, I said, "Well, what do you remember of church at Christmas?" And she said, "Oh, I remember we used to sing Silent Night and light the lamps, and I remember the smell of the oil lamps." I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, let me read you the story." And so I had to use a big voice because she was in a room with three, and one of them had a breathing machine. And if you've ever experienced, they're really loud. So there's this loud noise of the breathing machine. So I muster my loudest voice, and I read the well-known story of Luke, we all know. She said, "Oh, I remember the singing." I said, "Yeah." "Would you like me to sing?" "Yes," she said. I'm like, "Okay." So unaccompanied, with a bit of a wavering voice, singing as loudly as I could, I started on Silent Night. I don't think I hit many of the right notes. And she really couldn't sing. She mouthed the words. And then one by one, the nurses came into the room and sang with me. And we soon had a whole choir singing in that room, all singing together, like this crowd of angels had come into that room. And it was the most profound experience of church and of grace at Christmas. It was the only Christmas service that church had. We never did get the power back for Christmas Day. So it was just us singing in that palliative care room, and that was the only Christmas. And I will never forget that chorus of angels in that room singing Silent Night.
Anyone else?
I've got a quick one. Earlier this year, I was planning to go to the Diaconal Center for Christian Studies in Winnipeg, but for various reasons that wasn't going to work out. I was really wondering what I was going to do and how I was going to do it. One Friday, I got a call from Andrew Atchison at Emmanuel College and went in to talk to him, but it was quite a bit after the deadline to come in, so I thought we would talk about the year after, and he said, no, you could come here. You can come. It doesn't matter that you're a little bit late. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, but I don't know how I'll be able to afford it. I've got a family. Our rent is already kind of killing us, even though it was relatively cheap for Toronto. So I went back home, and 2 days later, my landlord said, Chris, you got to move out. My family's going to move into your apartment. Sorry, you've got 2 months to move out. I was like, wow, gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do now. And I called up just out of, a whim. I called up family housing at University of Toronto, where there's usually a minimum 1 year wait to get into family housing. Called them up, explained my story, and they said, yeah, I'd love to help you. There's a 1 year wait to get into family housing. But did you say you lived in Toronto? Could you move in next month? If you could, we got a spot. I was like, oh, really? Well, okay. And it turns out that the family housing was significantly cheaper than our current rent. And boom, boom, boom. I was at Emmanuel College, just like that. It was pretty amazing. I felt the hand of God moving in that one.
Well, we're at the end of our time, but we aren't at the end of our stories. Share with one another your stories of grace. They're there. It's a matter simply of identifying them and telling them. I want to thank once again our panel. Such beautiful stories that you told. We've got a wonderful God, and let's close in prayer. O gracious and loving God, you cloak us with grace in every day, and you put us into your story. So may we carry you into the stories of our lives. We pray for peace. We pray for mercy. We pray for forgiveness, knowing that even before we have uttered this prayer, you have responded in your grace, and we thank you. Amen.